So, Jonathan Zimmerman, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but your position is that free speech, the right to free speech, is paramount. And
Yes.
therefore, if you have something nasty to say, even if maybe morally you shouldn't say it, you're certainly allowed to. You should be allowed to. You should be legally entitled to, and we should
Yeah,
encourage.
but there are limits to every right,
Yeah.
right? Every
Right.
single right has limits.
But you feel that what's going on now at college campuses has not exceeded the limit of free
For the
speech.
most part, no. I mean, look, there was a kid at Yale that got injured by a flag. There were kids at the new school that were trapped inside a library. There have been people who have been physically intimidated, right, or even injured. And Jake, we have 100 years of constitutional law to help us with this, right? To help us with these limits, right? There are all kinds of limits on free speech, but they've developed over the years, and we should be drawing on those developments. You
But
can't
isn't
call
that
up the
what's
White House and say, I'm going to shoot the president. If you're a professor, you can't say to a female student or any student, I really like the sweater you're wearing, and if you wear it tomorrow, I'll give you an A. Most sexual harassment is verbal, and it is against the law, as it should be. So that's another good example of a limit on free speech.
So let's try to dissect what's going on at college campuses and decide what crosses the line, what doesn't. Because I think what you're saying, it's not that you're opposed to all of the constraints in college campuses. You're not just saying, hey, anything goes. What you're saying
Anything
is
doesn't go.
you have outlined, but are you against the reforms that are happening right now? I guess here's at the crux of my question. What do you think about Title VI? This idea that some lawmakers are arguing that universities' lack of action, not action, but lack of action against protesters might be violating that law. And that law, Title VI, is meant to protect students from discrimination and harassment.
I am deeply skeptical. I do not
Why?
doubt that there's discrimination on campuses, but Samuel Johnson said patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. And I'm inclined to say that at this point in American history, Title VI is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Do you really want
What does that
the
mean?
federal Department of Education deciding that, which campuses have such a terrible climate that the federal government is going to penalize them for? Do you want that? Suppose the other party, the party you don't like, gets into power. Do you want their Department of Education surveying all of our campuses, Jake, all of them, and deciding which have just the right climate and which don't? I don't want to live there. To me, that's much scarier than anything that's happened right now.
It's saying that, I thought what it's saying is that universities should not discriminate based on race or nationality. That's what Title VI is saying.
Well, right. But I think what the advocates who want to use Title VI are saying is that if the federal government finds that there's a discriminatory climate on campus, and also finds that the university is not, in the view of the government, addressing it adequately, that the university is going to sanction and penalize, is going to be sanctioned and penalized by that same government. And that doesn't fit my understanding of what democracy is, what academic freedom is. That's a terrifying prospect.
Should students on campus? Sorry.
No. Go ahead.
I'm running. I'm speaking too quickly. Should students on campuses be allowed to espouse racist and anti-Semitic comments if that's what they are?
They should be allowed to say what they want, provided that it doesn't create a direct threat of physical violence, harassment, and intimidation. Now, I understand that those are somewhat subjective terms, right? And obviously, everything is going to depend on the circumstances, right?
So you could have a protest that's explicitly racist. Like you could have a KKK protest, or you could have a KKK rally at Harvard, or
I think a KKK rally would probably fall under the harassment and intimidation thing. Because
where's the line?
Well, right. Look, that's a totally reasonable question. But it seems to me that if you want to restrict anything in America, the burden is on you, not the speaker, on you, the restrictor, to show why this represents harassment and intimidation. And people walking around in robes and crosses, that seems like a pretty easy call to me. I think the harder lift, the heavier lift, is people walking around saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. Globalize the intifada. Jake, let me be clear to you about where my own instincts lie. I'm Jewish. A big part of my family moved to Palestine in the 1930s. The brother of my grandfather started the Palestine Post. I have deep roots in Israel, and I regard both of those statements as anti-Semitic. But I do not believe that my definition of that and my instincts should be the modal ones here, because I understand that there are reasonable people that hear those statements in another way, right? So do we really want our universities, or God forbid, the Federal Department of Education promulgating a list of things and saying, okay, from the river to the sea, that's anti-Semitic, all right? Globalized intifada, no, right? Do you want that? I don't.
But if something is explicitly, let's stick with the racist or KKK analogy, because I think it's more clear cut. I mean, you agree that if something is, so some of these protests, they have turned violent, right?
Sure, and obviously we have to interdict that. I mean, what happened at Cooper Union? It wasn't the new school, Cooper Union. Like, those kids are trapped inside the library, and people are shouting names at them and banging on the windows, right? That's physical intimidation, right? And again, you know, we have lots of history, and we have lots of smart people that have helped us make these discriminations in the past. They're not always easy, right? But we should draw on our experience, and we should draw on our knowledge. This isn't the first time we've had to decide what constitutes threatening speech and what doesn't, right? I mean, this isn't de novo.
Should it be evaluated on an ad hoc basis? In other words, if you see part of the protests are violent, part of the protests are explicitly, let's say, anti-Semitic. So I know that there's some pro-Palestinian protests which they really just care about saving Palestinians, and they're horrified by what's happening in the war, and that's totally justified. Right. And there are some people who then take it 3 steps farther and say, no, actually, we also blame Jews, or we blame the Jews, and so you'd agree that the latter bucket maybe is prohibited, but the former should not be. I mean,
it would only be prohibited, in my view, right, if they, at that moment, in that circumstance, were posing a direct threat to the physical safety of other people, right? We do have a job. We do have a responsibility to protect that. But there's a difference between physical safety and this broader understanding of, like, psychological safety or safetyism. It's like, you know, Jake, I'm feeling really unsafe now, right? I mean, like, what does that even mean, right? Hey, if somebody's hitting you with a flag, you feel unsafe. I get it, right? And that has to be prohibited. But we can't stretch this idea of safety to cover anything that we find repellent, right? Then there's not going to be anything protected at all.
So then, what was wrong with what Claudine Gay said in her testimony?
Well, there was nothing wrong with it, except that he wasn't honest about the different ways that Harvard had restricted other kinds of free speech. That was really the problem, right? You know, and again, you can't go backwards in time.
You don't have a problem with her not condemning anti-Semitism?
No, I don't have a problem with her saying, like, I wouldn't stop any statement about genocide, because again, like, there are some people who think that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Let me emphasize, I am not one of those people, all right? But there's some. And, like, if that became the official view, then somebody supporting Israel's action in Gaza would be supporting genocide. Please understand, I'm not saying that's my view. I'm saying that this is not out of, that given what's happening on our campus now, this is not out of the question. This can happen.
Not out of it. You're allowed to protest Israel.
Right, but if everyone on campus, or if most people on campus think Israel is committing genocide, then a statement, we stand with Israel in Gaza, that would be like, we stand with Hitler in Poland, right?
Right.
It would be genocidal speech, and we can't have genocidal speech. No genocidal speech now, right? So that would be off the table.
What about but this, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that aside from Israel, Palestine, those are like, that's a political statements. I'm saying, shouldn't it be not allowed for someone to single out a race like the Jews or black people? So, are you okay with that
I am
university?
not okay with it. I am
Are you
not
okay with
okay
that
with it.
at UPenn if
But
there's
I'm
a
not
protest?
okay with censoring it. The
So,
answer to that is free speech itself. The most important form of free speech that I know of is raising your voice against hateful speech. That is a form of free speech, and to me, the most vital form. Right? And if you think globalize the Intifada is anti-Semitic, get out there and scream that to the hills. But don't tell Manoush Shafiq or Joe Biden to ban it. Those are two different things.
what are the rules like at UPenn where you teach?
Yeah.
Can a group of 35 students have a protest where they 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 say we want black people or Hispanics to leave our country? We think they're worse than us. Is that
Well,
allowed?
I'll give you an example. There's a group of very fundamentalist Christians that come to campus sometimes and say things like, I'm just going to say what they say. This is horrible. This is what they say. God hates fags. You've heard about these people before, right? And they're allowed to do that. And I think it's an
Well, hold
exactly
on.
the
No,
same problem where
they're allowed
against
to. They're
things.
not. They're not allowed to come on campus. They're allowed to do
Yes,
that.
they are. Oh,
On
yeah, they do it on campus. Absolutely. Now, like they also do it in a specified area. They don't do it in classrooms or in dormitories. So
Mhm.
there are time and place restrictions that are also, again, Jake, part of our constitutional heritage, right?
So they
So
came. That
yes,
group came to Brandeis. We didn't let them on campus because we said, like, listen, like this is a free
and
country, free speech. You can say whatever you want in America,
yeah,
but that doesn't mean you can come onto the campus. It's private property. They can't come onto your backyard. So why should UPenn let
Penn
them onto the
Penn
campus?
does. Well, because anybody else can come into campus, right? We don't have guards at the gates saying, excuse me, are your views good enough that you can come into Penn today? Right? We don't do that, right? Imagine how many other heinous people, Jake, are harboring awful, terrible thoughts, or even saying them to each other, right? We don't create a linguistic hygiene or a thought police where we examine everyone who comes through the gates and says, now, do you have the right ideas here? Like ones that are consistent with what we think? I don't think we should do that, But again, time and place matters, right? Those people couldn't do what they do in a classroom or in a dorm. So you can say globalize the Intifada, but you can't start screaming that in the middle of a lecture, right? Because then you're interfering with learning, right?
But
So
doesn't
those
the
things matter.
that group you're describing that says all the
Yeah, the
horrible
Westmoreland church people.
that's
Yeah,
that's the Westborough Baptist Church, right?
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
So
if a student at University of Pennsylvania decided to then join the Westborough Baptist Church and was walking around campus every day saying these horrible things, doesn't
mhm.
the school have the right? They're a private institution. Don't they have the right to suspend or expel that student because they're saying, "Hey, listen, you're saying a lot of racist things. Racism is bad. We don't like racism. We can. These are our rules. We're gonna
Right.
expel you." When
I
that
think they
wouldn't
I
it be
think they
justified?
do as a matter of law at a private school. I think you're right. They do have that right. Okay. The
Right.
question is whether they should exercise it.
Why
Right.
shouldn't they? Why should they not expel a student
Here's why.
yeah.
Because Jake, once they do that, right, then somebody who supports the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action is going to be going across campus saying, "Woohoo! No more affirmative action." Affirmative action was hurting Penn by letting in all these unqualified people of color. Frankly, Jake, I think that would insult a larger number of people than the example you're talking about. I think some people could arguably call it racist. Get rid of that guy. Get rid of him. Because, he hurts people. He really does.
But we don't have to. But we don't have to pretend that everything is like that. We can't draw a line between one thing to the next. And what's a slip? I think it's an unfair characterization to say, well, if you ban certain things, then where do you stop? And how do you know it's a slippery slope? I mean, if someone's uh, saying horrible, explicit racist things that are clearly racist, I think we can point to them and say that's racism and not be worried about a slippery slope
You
effect
can
or
point to them and
about
say that's racism for sure.
and
And like I
say you're
said, you should. Like that's speech. Like, like, speak out, man. Right? If you think that it's bigoted, say it's bigoted. Right? Do that. Right? But don't ask mommy or daddy university to do this work, right? And don't empower them in that way. Use your own voice, use your own speech and say, I think you're wrong and I think you're bigoted for the following reasons. Do that.
So what is Title VI? Because I think what can make this debate a little more objective is the fact that there is some sort of law that does
There
legally
is.
prohibit. So what is Title VI?
And
And does it?
there's some 100 investigations about which I'm very concerned.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's the one that bans, it bans discrimination along all the lines that you're saying. But it also has been held to mean that if a university is experiencing those kinds of discriminations and is not taking action, that the federal government can exert sanctions against them. That's the way
And
I understand it. And that's what
how
these
do you feel about
investigations
Title
are
VI?
about.
Is there a place for Title VI? Do you believe it? Or do you think it's wrong?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. I mean, just, imagine a university that wasn't accepting people that were gay or, wasn't admitting people that were female. You would invoke Title VI and you would say, now, wait a minute, right? There are laws against that, right? And by the way, right, there should be, right? But that's not about expression. That's about behavior, and that's about action, and that's about really important decisions that university makes about whom to admit. I mean, we can imagine a million other things, right? But let's also remember that even those decisions are going to involve some very tough calls. Look at all the questions now about trans athletes on women's teams. I absolutely understand why lots of people think that like a trans female athlete should be on the swim team. And I also understand why there are some people, including female swimmers, that don't agree with that. Both of them are going to invoke Title IX. So it's not always going to speak, right? I mean, with an exactly clear voice. There are going to be, to use a loaded term, difficult discriminations. There always are.
Is Title IX being used appropriately right now at universities?
Title VI? Well, I don't know enough
Title
about I don't know enough about the investigations, to be honest. I am extremely worried about them.
But is there a place for Title VI to be used to block someone who's trying to make racist? By the way, I'm not talking about pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. I think you're allowed to have whatever political stance you want. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who are making explicit racial comments about saying I hate this specific group of people.
Right.
Should Title VI be allowed to block those people from?
Well, look, if that group is targeted to the point where they are being physically harassed, right, and they're facing threats of physical violence, and the university is not doing anything about it, of course. Right.
But that's what's going. But that is what's going on, or that is what that's.
Well, that's the question, right? That's the question, right? And again, these things are subtle and difficult, right? There's nothing simple about them, right? But again, the default has to be speech. That is, if what you want to do is restrict speech, you have to show in extremely concrete and tangible terms, right, that it represents this sort of direct threat. So let me give you a very obvious example, right? There are people in Israel, in the government, that think that Palestinians should not live in the West Bank, that they should all be evicted from the West Bank. If you said that on a college campus, would you be making a racist remark? I think arguably yes, but I wouldn't want to ban it. Let me be clear, I find it reprehensible and astonishing that there are people in the Netanyahu government that say things like that. And I say that as a supporter of Israel. I find that I find that view vicious and loathsome. But I would not want it banned from college campus. Would you?
Um, if there's a view that I guess it shouldn't be, because that's a view that's being held by a government official at a country that we're partnered with.
I'd say that makes it worse.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, but it's a view that needs to be understood, because it has a real impact. It's not that we can't dismiss it, because if someone in a government that we're working with believes in something, then we should understand what's going on.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, yeah.
If there were if a group of students at UPenn decided to become Nazis and march around campus every day with swastikas,
yes,
do they have the right to do that?
No, I think again that's in the Klan category.
Because Nazism stands for violence, you're saying?
Yes, and I think most reasonable people would view the swastika as an immediate and direct threat to the well-being of other people, not just Jews, right? Gay people, Romas, right?
My understanding is that the Title VI and the controversy about schools is not about the fact. It's not. They're not saying that people can't protest for Palestine. Of course.
Right.
Of course, people can protest for Palestine.
Right.
My understanding is what they're saying is you can't protest against Jews or a group of people. Do you agree with the delineation that I'm making? And do you agree do you agree that protesting for Palestine is absolutely permitted, whereas protesting against Jews?
But see, the distinction is never that clear, right? I mean, that's what all this stuff about Zionism is about, right? I mean, there are lots of people, including some Jews, saying, I can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. And then there are other people saying, no, anti-Zionism is the heart of anti-Semitism, right? It is what you're calling an anti-Jewish statement. And again,
well, I don't agree with that.
I'm not saying that I agree with that necessarily, but there's a dominant strand, right, of Jews who think that statements like the Jews should not have a Jewish homeland in the Middle East, they regard that as what you're calling, Jake, a statement against Jews, right? And again, they're not unreasonable to say that, right? It's hard, man, and it's precisely because it's hard that we need to let people speak it out.
Well, we definitely need to be able to criticize Israel just like we can criticize any country. And I agree, if it can't be the case that any statement against Israel is necessarily viewed as an anti-Semitic statement. So I agree that Israel is not beyond condemnation. That's not my point, though. My point is that I think, and maybe we're saying the same thing, but I think there are people who are not saying, hey, lift this, have a ceasefire in Gaza. I think there are people who are saying, we don't like Jews no matter where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that Palestinians have the right to, they're in some way implying more than just, we don't like Israel. They're implying we don't like Jews.
I think From the River to the Sea says that in some people's minds. And I think some of the speakers are probably saying that too.
Wouldn't that, if you think that Nazism shouldn't be allowed on campuses, and you're saying that anything that's calling for violence or calling for that sort of, I guess here's my question: Why is Nazism not allowed on campus, and why doesn't that apply to the river, from the river to the sea? Assuming that from the river to the sea implies, like, I guess, a genocide of.
Yeah, I mean, look, and again, from the river to the sea, again, like, I think reasonable people disagree about what that means, and I think it means different things coming from different mouths in different circumstances. That's my point. But to compare it to Nazism is invidious, and here's why. I mean, here I think what the educators call the Tinker standard can be really useful. And so Tinker v. Des Moines is the one about the kid wearing the black armband to Warren G. Harding Middle School in Des Moines. He gets sent home, and the court said, you can speak, but not all the time and not in any circumstance. Tinker doesn't say a kid can say whatever she wants. Here's what it says. If the school wants to restrict the speech, and note again where the burden is, not on the kid, but on the school. If the school wants to restrict the speech, it's got to show that whatever the kid is saying, or in this case doing, represents an immediate threat to learning. It's going to interfere with learning. And, during the oral arguments for that case, you might recall Thurgood Marshall asked the lawyer from the school district, okay, there are 18,000 kids that morning in Des Moines. How many are wearing armbands? And he says 7. And Marshall says, that's all you got? That interferes with learning? So it seems to me that we should also be calling on that now. And it seems to me that this helps with the Nazi and the Klan thing. If you've got kids walking around, anybody walking around with swastikas, I think most reasonable people are going to say that's going to interfere with learning, because the symbol itself has so much power and such a deep history, right, that it's going to be pretty difficult for anybody to do much of anything. I just don't think the river to the sea, however reprehensible it might be, falls into that category.
How do you decide that? How do you?
Again, look, it is not easy, right? And that's why the default has to be discussion. We should be talking about exactly this question, right? Because it's so hard. You know who interfered the most with learning on the Columbia campus? The cops who took the encampment away. That's what I think, right? Most of the encampments were in no reasonable way interfering with learning. Look, if the encampment is like right in front of a classroom and people can't get in, or in front of a dorm, that's a no-brainer. You have to take it away. But Jake, I went to Columbia. I know the campus. I know where the most of the tents were. They were on John Jay Lawn. I do not believe they were interfering with people's learning. I'd go even farther. If they remained, and if we could actually talk to each other about this question, the question that you're raising, what these lines are, people would learn way more than they do in their classes, which are too easy already. We would learn more.
Quick time check. You have to leave in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll go. Your questions are so good. I'll go a little bit farther. You're very good at this, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So,
because you ask hard questions, right?
So,
there are no softballs here.
So Nazism on campus is prohibited for one reason, you're saying, and that reason is because it interferes with learning. Now that standard, you're setting right there is a hard standard, because that is so opaque and vague. And you're saying that, and how do we try to quantify or objectify that? I would say, Nazism absolutely represents death to lots of people. Whereas what you're saying is from the river to the sea doesn't necessarily represent that, because not maybe people think, maybe some people just think it means, hey, Palestinians want to be able to go into Israel freely.
Right. And look, and that's not maybe, some people do interpret it that way, right? Other people don't. Right? I don't think there's a lot of ambiguity in interpreting a swastika. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's face it, right? There just isn't. The river to the sea has ambiguity around it. That's why we're talking about it, right? You and I are not debating the meaning of a swastika today, right? We understand that it's a hateful symbol, and so does every other sentient being. From the river to the sea is not in that category.
If the threshold is just anything that disrupts learning, I mean, that's a pretty low threshold, I've got to say. And I'm surprised that you said that, because earlier in this conversation, everything that you were saying indicated that you felt the threshold was high, that you should be able to say anything you want, even if it is repulsive. And now you're saying, actually, the threshold is just if it disrupts learning. So I could say, okay, well, if 63.5% of students interpret from the river to the sea to be a violent statement, then that disrupts learning for at least half students.
Well, again, I mean, that wasn't what Tinker said, right? Tinker said you have to show an immediate and direct disruption of learning, right? And they're very clear about this, the court. They say you can't just say, oh, this might annoy people and disrupt their learning, right? No, I mean, this is why, you can't stand up in the middle of algebra class and start screaming slurs at your teacher, right? That's a direct threat to, it's a material interference with learning. And so no, it just can't be anything that might worry somebody, right, or inhibit their learning. It's got to be absolute and direct. And
What
I think
about?
this, yeah. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I'm cutting you
No,
off, and I'm sorry. It's
no,
because
no, please go ahead.
I'm sorry that I'm jumping in.
Yeah.
What about Nazism or the KKK? What about it is a interruption to learning?
Well, again, I think this is where it overlaps with the intimidation and harassment part, right? I think what the reason it disrupts learning is that the symbol itself is unambiguously hateful. And I also think that there's not any debate, any meaningful debate on the assertion, right? Like, I mean, if you want to try to argue with me that the swastika isn't an obvious symbol of hate, I mean, I'll listen to you because I listen to everyone. But I think you're going to have a really hard time persuading me or anybody.
So the second part is there's no reason for debate, and the first part is that it is.
It is a manifest and shared symbol of hatred that is, it isn't just disruptive, right? It's going to be something that's going to create such a huge amount of fear and anger that we're not going to be able to do what we need to do.
I mean, these seem like I could make the same argument then about From the River to the Sea if enough people.
You could, except we don't have a consensus on that, right? We don't, right? We just don't. There is no swastika-like consensus on From the River to the Sea. That's not an opinion. That's a fact.
So the other thing that matters for preventing, for whether a hateful speech is preventing learning, is whether there's consensus around what that speech represents. And what about if some of the encampment, if some of the protesters at these campuses, like let's say Columbia, if some of them are making an unambiguous statement asking for violence against a certain race or people, wouldn't that fall into the same category as the swastika or the
Well, look, if they all were, yeah. I mean, if everyone in the encampment was surrounding Jews and saying, go back to Poland, and we've all seen those clips, right? That would be a different situation. But I also think these clips are in some ways themselves a problem because what they do is they trick us into thinking that all the protesters are saying horrible anti-Semitic stuff. Are some of them saying horrible anti-Semitic stuff? They are, and you can see them on YouTube, right? But it is a massive distortion, and it's pretty dishonest to imagine that all these protesters are doing and saying that. They're not. It's just not true. I mean, again, I'm saying this as somebody who believes in Israel, although doesn't support everything that Israel does, just like I believe in America and don't support everything that America does. I'm not saying this because I have any particular agreement with what these protesters are saying. But let me go further about why this matters to me so deeply. Here's why. If these protesters, if their thesis is we should have free speech to say from the river to the sea, well, I agree with you. Okay, I do. But some of these students are from the same demographic, from the same part of the campus left, that for years and years has been saying, we need to restrict speech that's racist and sexist and transphobic because it hurts people. And I keep saying to them, you know what? From the river to the sea hurts people, for sure. I can prove it. But that's a terrible, terrible reason to censor it. So my hope would be, however vain this hope is, that actually we could use this moment to create a new consensus about speech instead of adding ever more restrictions, which is a fool's error. Admit that we were in error when we tried to restrict all this other hurtful speech. My fear, of course, is that this will not happen because none of us really believe in the principle. We just want our own speech and we want to hammer the other guy, right? So these same people, these same protesters, the next time there's somebody on campus saying something they think is transphobic, Are they going to say, oh, wait, we wanted the right to say from the river to the sea. We better let this person say that there shouldn't be trans female athletes on the team. They're probably not going to say that. They're going to say that's transphobic. Let's stamp it out. That's the heart of the problem.
It's an interesting point. And last quick question. I asked earlier about Claudine Gay. I want to come back to that because the main criticism of Claudine Gay and why she ultimately had to resign is because she refused to condemn anti-Semitism. So that was the critique.
Genocide, I think.
I think it was
yeah.
So should she? But when I asked you about her, I'm not sure that you agreed with the criticism of her. So do you agree that the mistake Claudine Gay made was that she did not condemn genocide, or was there, or was that not a mistake?
There was more. Again, look.
But was that a mistake? Was that a mistake as well? Or
here's what I would have liked her to say. I would have liked her to say, okay, first of all, I condemn genocide and I condemn bigotry of all kinds. All right. And so should you. All right. But we also know that people interpret statements differently, good-willed people. And I don't want to be in the position of saying what is so horrible and so genocidal that you can't say it. Secondly, all right, in order to take that position, I have to be honest about the fact that Harvard has restricted other kinds of speech and has not always defended this principle with as much strength and consistency as it should have. And from now on, that's what it's going to do.
Got it. Well, Professor Jonathan Zimmerman, thanks so much for the time. I'm going to end the recording, and if you
good
30 seconds,
please do. Yeah,
you got to jump. So